George, let's start by talking about the most recent news out of Iraq. The U.S. military just conducted an airstrike against artillery held by ISIS outside the Kurdish city of Erbil. Do you worry that this could lead to full-blown U.S. military involvement again beyond these targeted strikes?
I would think so, but of course there are many mysteries in this story, wrapped up in many enigmas. The ISIS, which is so extreme it was expelled by Al-Qaeda, who don't need reminding, the United States viewers committed mass murder in New York on 9/11, and yet they have been allowed to take over almost all of Iraq, certainly more than 50% of it, including some of the great cities of Iraq, and they're within shooting distance of the capital itself. Without these allies who spent $1 trillion and thousands of the lives of the soldiers of the Anglo-American invasion force, as well as, of course, 1 million Iraqi lives in order to bring about democracy in Iraq. And yet they have sat on their hands whilst Al-Qaeda took over more than half of the country, including great dams and other oil fields and other things, including banks, which they've looted and made off with hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's a mystery why it's taken so long for President Obama to organize these airstrikes, a mystery that makes many people in the Arab world suspicious about who ISIS really are, who they're really working for. But secondly, of course, as I think I inferred from your question, it will not work. Targeted airstrikes every now and again against a military force that's sweeping all before it and has the tacit support, at least, of the country's Sunni Muslim minority and the active support of the Sunni Muslim hinterland in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, is not going to work. And so the logic, ineluctably, is that the United States and Britain will be drawn back into Iraq in a very, very serious way. And that won't work either. So we really are in a mess. As half an Irishman myself, I'm entitled to say, as the apocryphal Irishman said, when asked the way to such and such a place, well, I wouldn't have started from here, the man replied.
It is a tragedy. It's a complete mess, George. You're right about that. And ISIS didn't form in a vacuum. How much of what's currently happening on the ground is a direct result of U.S. and U.K. foreign policy in Iraq and Syria?
Oh, all of it. Tony Blair and George Bush are entirely responsible for this mess. Iraq was one country. Sectarianism and extremism was mercilessly crushed. There were no armed militias roaming the country, and there were 1 million more Iraqis than there are today, because 1 million of them died. Almost 1 million of them died prior to that in the US-UK sanctions regime. Now Iraq is atomized. It's not one country. It's not even 3 countries. It's maybe 30 countries, every one of them controlled by an armed militia, usually with a fundamentalist, extremist religious stripe, and they're murdering each other in very large numbers.
And yesterday we just learned that ISIS forces took control of Iraq's largest dam. And Mosul, obviously the possibility that ISIS will use this dam as a weapon to flood cities is very real. Is there realistically a military solution at all to stop this from happening?
Well, if I was forced to take the keys of this runaway vehicle, I would do this. I would try to involve the neighbors, all of whom have an interest in an Al-Qaeda offshoot not taking over one of the world's major oil producers, a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious state. And I would try somehow to infuse people, especially in the army, with the idea that there is any longer something called Iraq that's worth fighting for and worth losing your life for. That means bringing in Iran. It means also Iran working with Saudi Arabia. The Saudi regime dictatorship is, of course, ultimately mortally threatened by this ISIS formation. And it means reaching out to the Iraqi Sunni Muslims, who have felt for a long time, more than a decade, that the country is not run with their interests in mind, and that the government of al-Maliki is an entirely sectarian one, not to mention a very rampantly corrupt one. So I'd make political changes. I would reach out to all the communities. I would release political prisoners, many of whom have been held for now 11, going on for 12 years, for no good reason. I would re-legitimize the Arab nationalist forces within Iraq, and I'd try to make an alliance with them. I'd say, do you really want to be run by a caliphate that was expelled from al-Qaeda because it was too extreme, because it was too sectarian? I don't think in the end, if you did that, you would have that much difficulty in marginalizing these people. But the fundamental flaw in our policy is that when these people cross over into Syria, as they do, crisscrossing between the two countries, they become our allies. And we're bombing them now in Iraq, but we're giving them bombs when they're operating in Syria, and they have torn Syria apart. And their vile creed of sectarian hatred has, of course, ripped the fabric of Syrian society, possibly beyond repair.
Right, and this context, of course, is missing from all the mainstream media analysis of the situation. No one's talking about how ISIS was emboldened and strengthened in this vacuum, crossing over into Syria. Of course, I'm being called an ISIS apologist and a Hamas apologist because I don't support bombing campaigns for the third time in the country. George, let's move on to an extremely turbulent area of the world, Gaza. Of course, today the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was broken. Israel's resumed strikes in response to Hamas rockets. What's your response to those who say Hamas's decision to break the ceasefire shows they're not willing to negotiate?
Well, the ceasefire had finished. It elapsed after 72 hours. It was not a ceasefire, but a pause in the large-scale massacre of Palestinians trapped in the Gaza concentration camp, the biggest concentration camp in the world, in which almost 2 million people are trapped behind the barbed wire in an area 25 miles long and 4.5 miles wide. Nowhere run, nowhere to hide. And so the context, as you mentioned the word earlier, is this, that Israel has stolen the Palestinians' land, wiped their country off the map, scattered their people to the four corners of the earth, besieges Gaza, controlling even the calorie intake of every Gazan, 80% of whom are reliant on international food aid, 80% of whom are unemployed, and 80% of the children in Gaza are malnourished, according to the United Nations. They have occupied the West Bank, covered it, paved it with hundreds of illegal settlements, built military roads crisscrossing the territory, an apartheid wall, checkpoints by the hundred, and they have illegally annexed East Jerusalem and are in the process of ethnically cleansing the Arab, Muslim, and Christian population from Jerusalem. So if you're not going to have resistance to that, you're not going to have resistance to anything. The word Hamas is just a shorthand for the Palestinian resistance, who actually are members of all kinds of political and military organizations. But if you invade somebody's country, if you occupy it, if you fundamentally alter its character, and if after 67 years there is no conceivable political or peaceful or diplomatic way out, the people will rise up. And that's what the Palestinians are doing. In the Second World War, the heroes of the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw, the Warsaw Ghetto, the people decided that they would not die one by one, 10 by 10, on their knees, waiting for their captors to murder them, but would rise up and, if necessary, die on their feet. And they wrote their name in the stars. They are amongst the greatest heroes of the Second World War. They broke out from their barbed wire and they confronted the fascists who were killing them one by one, 10 by 10. And that's, frankly, all that the Palestinians are trying to do.
What's amazing about that, George, is the tunnels that existed back then as well. And you can look back at the days of slavery here, the tunnels here. So it's amazing to just keep calling these terror tunnels. We're going to go and destroy all these. And of course, journalist Chris Hedges has cited this argument as well, where he cites the Article of Self-Defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. A helpless civilian population has the right to protect itself, to resist against weapons of industrial warfare. What is the solution here, George? Two-state solution, one-state solution?
Well, I frankly supported the Oslo Agreement when it was written almost 20 years ago. But 20 years later, not only is not 1 centimeter of Palestine free of Israeli occupation or siege or annexation, the West Bank demographic and topographic alterations made by the illegal settlements and so on that I mentioned make any possibility of a two-state solution otiose. And frankly, to talk about a two-state solution now is to fly in the face of reality. It's a tiny place. It's smaller than one park in South Africa. Apartheid South Africa became one single democratic state from one end to the other, in which black people and white people lived as equal citizens under the law, with one man, one woman, one vote. And that's the best solution for the Israel-Palestine conflict too. Some people say that's never going to happen. Well, the so-called two-state solution is never going to happen either, and that's not a solution, so why should people fight for it?
Right. I mean, we should let the chips fall where they may. Of course, things aren't perfect still in South Africa, but ending the apartheid state is the first step. George, let's talk about Sayeeda Warsi, the former senior foreign office minister in the UK, who publicly resigned over the government policy on Gaza. She says it's morally indefensible, where after 4 weeks of a conflict, more than a quarter of the Gazan population displaced, nearly 2,000 people killed, 400 innocent children. We still cannot find the words to say we condemn this, and we feel this action has been disproportionate. Of course, in the U.S., it's the same thing, George. Why is Israel given so much impunity from the West time and again?
Well, in the U.S. Senate, as you will know, they voted 97-0 to defend Israel's war, to condemn the Palestinian resistance, and to condemn the United Nations for having voted to investigate allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's as stark an example of the stranglehold which the Israel lobby has over American politics. Now, I very purposefully say Israel lobby, not Jewish lobby, because, of course, the vast majority of the Israel lobby in the United States are fanatic Christians, not Jews. Many of them, maybe most of them, don't even like Jews. And many Jews are on our side. Religious Jews, secular, progressive Jews are marching with us. So this is not a dichotomy about religion. It's a dichotomy about justice and injustice. And the United States government and its Congress has nailed its colors on the side of injustice. And I'm here to tell you that that's just not in the United States' own national interest. Most people in the world regard Israel as a rogue terrorist state. They regard the crimes of Israel as being beyond the pale. And they know that every crime is paid for and politically buttressed by the United States of America, which provides the money, the weapons, the political and diplomatic and even media support. That's making billions of people in the world hate the United States even more than they perhaps already did. That cannot be a US national interest. So all I ask from the United States government is that you somehow find the backbone to stand up for your own country's interest, rather than burning all of your remaining political capital in defense of the indefensible.
Absolutely. And we just heard that not only the financial support, the surveillance support to track and target Palestinians as well unbelievable. George, let's wrap this up with an update on your documentary called The Killing of Tony Blair. What's the craziest thing you've uncovered while filming, and when should we expect the documentary to be released?
The documentary will be premiered, its world premiere, at the South by Southwest International Film Festival in Austin, Texas, quite close to Crawford, Texas, where Tony Blair and George W. Bush, I'm not making this up, got down on their knees and prayed for the success of their adventure that they were about to launch. Imagine. Its British premiere will be a week later at the Edinburgh Film Festival. So March, it will be out. With all guns blazing. We have discovered secrets about the financial treasure chest, the phenomenal, fantastic $100 million bounty, $100 million that Tony Blair has amassed in the last 7 years. We have talked to people who are his victims. By the end of our film, by the time the titles come up, and your name will be in those titles, by the time those titles come up, nobody will employ Tony Blair. He'll be sacked as the so-called peace envoy in the Middle East, and I hope he'll be on his way to The Hague and to jail.
It's about time. Thank you so much, George Galloway, member of the Respect Party in Parliament. Always appreciate your amazing insight.